So hello everybody, and we are welcome today on our program, our guest, the political advisor, Jeyson Jey Smart. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm finally glad to meet you personally, and it's hopefully it will ease our conversation.
Sure.
I'm fine, thank you. So how do you feel actually in Kiev? Do you feel safe?
Yeah, of course. I mean, let's be honest, Kiev is quite safe. I mean, I think that statistically it's still much more dangerous, the driving and the accidents than anything else. I mean, yeah, it's very safe here.
Even if you hear all these alarms all the time, it doesn't scare you?
No, I mean, there's the alarms, but I think that the reality is that, you know, it is a very safe city. Even in spite of Russia's best attempts to make it not a safe city, it remains a very safe city.
Hopefully it will remain the same, but let's start with the question that I asked to your colleague from Italian Political Science Institute, Natalie Tocci. I talked lately, and we have a lot of talks about Ukraine and Russia, and it's obvious why. But it was interesting for me, what is the view on the situation and how it changed the attitude of politics and of audience inside the European Union from her point of view, affected by this war. So I want to ask you how it changed the attitude of politicians in the United States and the society. About society we'll talk later. Do you have the view of any changes in political attitudes, and what are they?
I mean, since the war started, I mean, there's always been a change. When it initially started, of course, things were very, very favorable. There was a lot of outrage about what's going on. And I don't think that anyone's changing their opinion and become pro-Russian, but I think that there has been a change in the level of intensity that people are following the situation in Ukraine. When it first started, it was the top story every single day in every newspaper and every television show. Today, it is lessened, but it doesn't mean it's become less important. I think that it remains a very important issue. It's still one of the top political issues in most of Europe and in the States for sure. But it's now, I think, just a lot of, time has passed. Other things are happening. The United States will have elections in a couple weeks. And so, the focus is much, it's just naturally occurring that, the focus changes over time.
If we talk about audience, it's very interesting what are the main problems and what's troubling the Americans today, except for Ukraine and election in the United States. What are beyond all the top messages in the newspapers and TV shows? To understand for us, because we heard a lot of, everybody's talking about Ukraine. 85 or 87% of Americans agree to give money to the Ukraine and help with weapons and everything. So where these numbers come from?
Well, there is still, very high interest. That's certainly the case. There's tremendous support. I was in the U.S. Just a couple weeks ago, and the amount of U.S. flags you would see everywhere was surprising. It's the first time I've gone to the U.S. since the war began. And I was really, really surprised that, in Washington, D.C., in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., it was quite often you would see Ukrainian flags, which is, I don't remember once in U.S. history, historically, I can't even think of an example, of when someone else's flag was so commonly bought and then hung outside of the houses of American citizens. So there is, trust me, a huge amount of interest and concern for what's happening in Ukraine.
It's, again, tells about this, what we call the era of post-truth that is going on in our society. And it doesn't change the points of view of people as we can observe, because even I didn't know, even in Oxford Dictionary, there's the concept of post-truth. And in this post-truth explanation, they remind the referendum of Britain's Brexit from the European Union and the presidential election in 2016. So from your point of view, this post-truth era goes on, and what is it, actually?
I'll be curious how they define it. I'd be very curious what the dictionary says. But in short, I think that the era that we're dealing with here is, it is worrying some that there is a sense in the population that what is truth and it's individualistic, that there is no one truth, that depends on the person and their own perception what is true. And what the problem with this becomes larger is if everybody believes that and there's no longer facts, but you have your facts and I have my facts, well, one, it's not rational, it's illogical. The fact is that most things are factual and you can be proved one way or the other. It's not subjective. But unfortunately, I think a lot of people enjoy subjectivity, where they can have an opinion that's contrary to others despite the overwhelming evidence. And it gives them a sense of, I don't know what they feel like, special. They feel special. That they can have an opinion that's not correlated to anything in reality, but that it's taken seriously by some. And that's sort of crazy.
Actually, it started with the new level of technical revolution when internet was invited and new rounds of development. But as we see, this informational technology has also become a punishment for humanity. So you have a lot of access to the information, but the way you use it, it shows what's going on in the world. So in this situation, how do you think this complete neglecting of professionalism around the world will bring the society or the people to degradation, or it may be improved somehow? And who may improve it?
I think that, unfortunately, there is a degradation in knowledge in society. Before, where we'd look at, for instance, I set the example of the encyclopedia, which was commonly bought before, and people had encyclopedias, and they would check things and reference things if they didn't know. And now, unfortunately, when people can Google, and you can read a website that has completely whatever some guy thinks posted there with no sort of citation, just simply listing meaningless comments of his, then it is a threat to society that people are taking seriously these sorts of things. And we've seen before that the rise of things like conspiracy theories amongst people, which have no base whatsoever, can be significant. And they can really be destabilizing even for an entire country if the whole population believes it. And that's a problem when you're dealing with something where you're not dealing with facts, we're not dealing with a common set of things that we can agree on, but rather every person individually chooses what is real or unreal. It does create the real potential for an entire swath, entire group of this population to become obsessed with things that are false.
Actually, maybe this is the good example what happened during 20 years in the Russian Federation, how collective Putin appeared in the Russian Federation, and he is the joker on the global scale right now. Do you think this is the only one joker, and to which point this joker can bring us?
Well, I think that there's, one of the, I think the most worrying things, if we were to talk about this idea of truth and what it is that it's very easy for someone such as Russia Today, literally Russia Today, the channel, but Russia, the country itself, to use this to manipulate populations, this misinformation, this disinformation, I should say. Mm-hmm. And this disinformation is very, very important because, once again, if you have a solid, the case of Ukraine is a great example. Russia illegally invaded Ukraine. It's that simple. That's all that happened. Russia invaded Ukraine. But if you read the Russian press, somehow it never says that, does it? It never says Russia has invaded Ukraine. It never says there's a war even with Ukraine. Yeah, there's just simply a special military operation. Yeah. And the number of people in the West that believe that, fortunately, is not such a big number, but there is a sizable number, millions and millions, tens of millions of people who really believe that. They really do believe that Ukraine was an aggressor against Russia, and this was forced. And why do they believe this?
Why?
Because of Russian propaganda, but also I think it's the fact that there's this entire thing that you have your truth and I have mine. Then even if I can prove to you demonstrably, and it's very clear that all the facts on the ground, it's very clear that there was in Bucha a massacre, in Irpin. It was very clear that Russia is occupying illegally against international law territories of Ukraine. It's very obvious that Ukraine was not a direct threat to Russia in any real sense, or any sense at all. And so why then do they believe this? And it's because I have a hypothesis that a lot of these people choose to just be different, to be contrarian than the rest of the population. And if everybody is supporting Ukraine, everybody can look at the facts and say that obviously, look at the photos of Bucha, it's very clear what happened there, or Irpin, it's very clear what happened there. But they believe crazy things, that it was fake, that it was actors. And this is absurd because, I mean, listen, there's hundreds of journalists that were there after it was released, open, or I should say liberated. And it seems clear to everybody, no, those were real people, real civilians that got killed. So how could you possibly argue with this? Because they're just, I think, trying to be contrarian, trying to be different, and they're desperate to defend Russia for whatever reason that is. Either they don't like the West or whatever, they try to defend Russia to a point that's absurd. And I think we see the natural absurdity in situations like we do today in Ukraine. The arguments that Russia makes and everything else, or the people that support Russia make, are completely irrational.
First, this inflation depends on the amount of money that's thrown by Russian Federation among the world in the propaganda, or in the ways of this propaganda. I mean, all the time we say that Russia is limited more and more in money, in possibility to earn money from energetic resources and others. But we still see that people get this information somehow. We see the closing of Russia Today, we see the closing of different other propaganda channels around the world, but still, somehow they get these messages. How it happens? It's the matter of money or the matter of instruments and how this twisted information is given to audience?
So I think it's a few factors, and I think that it's most important to note that where Russia Today is the most effective is where there's less of a market of media. I think that if you're somewhere like the United States, why the U.S. doesn't limit Russia Today is because there's not a lot of, viewership is not that big to begin with. It's quite limited. And the fact is that there's a lot of options to watch in the U.S. We have tons of TV channels. So why would you specifically choose Russia Today? You could, but it's not very common. Now, where Russia Today is effective is in Latin America and Africa and other places that are developing. And why is that? Because the quality of the television itself, if you watch Russia Today, the quality of production is high. It's attractive. It doesn't look bad. It doesn't look like it was filmed in a garage. Whereas a lot of major TV stations in developing countries do look like that. They do look like low quality. And I've worked in Latin American television before, and I say this with sincerity, is that, yes, I realize that there's a problem with that. The fact is they are able to take advantage of that, to be sort of shiny and new and cool looking. And so if it's really cool looking, it must mean they're also telling the truth. And so people watch it, and there's no competition, unfortunately. I mean, there is like Voice of America and things like this, which are far less popular. They don't have something equivalent to what we have here in the former Soviet states. Real time, these sorts of programs are not common down there in Latin America or in Africa. But what they need really is to have more of the truth so people can contrast what's going on in that. And that's why I think it's important for Ukraine to also be, the programs like this that are in English are important, but I also think it'd be good to have them in French and in Portuguese and in Spanish and other languages so that the rest of the world can understand the truth of what's going on here is not subjective, it's facts. And what's happening in Ukraine, there's no two different arguments. There's only one thing that's happening. And what Russia is saying, you don't have to be confused. They're lying. Just understand Russia's lying because that's what they've always done. And so what we are communicating here is obviously the truth of the situation in Ukraine. Ultimately, people have to make a decision that's rational. I mean, if somebody wishes to see something that's crazy, they're going to find that crazy thing all they want. And I guess the equivalency would be if we look at something that seems completely irrational, like conspiracy theories. And there are millions of people that believe tens of millions of people that believe conspiracy theories. And yet their perception is that that is real. And the problem with the perception is it's reality. If you really believe that's the case, for you it is. And I think in the case of like a scary example of where you see this in a large scale is look at Putin's, him and his circle. I think that they sincerely in their heart of hearts truly believe, one, they believe they're justified. That's clear. They really do believe that. But they also believe these sorts of crazy things. I think they sincerely believe that Ukraine is not a state, that Ukrainians want to be part of Russia. I think that he sincerely believes this.
And he stated it in his articles and his speeches openly.
He really believes this. I mean, and he hasn't been to Kiev recently because I don't think he'd get the same reaction if you were to ask people. But in his mind, this is real, and they sincerely believe it. And as crazy as it seems to us, the fact is world history does have this happen a lot. As we know, the Nazis were obsessed with the occult, and they had very strange Gnostic sort of beliefs. And you say, it's crazy. They didn't really believe that, did they? No, they really believe that. In the case of Putin, they really do believe this stuff that we read about that we think is absurd. For them, it's reality, and it's very worrisome.
But I cannot understand how some sort of politician around the world do believe what Putin writes in his articles and say in his speeches.
So it's a good question. I think that there's different levels. I think there's those who, for whatever reason, had a certain attachment to Russia as a country, or the Soviet Union before that, especially those on the far left. And for them, there's an inherent bias in favor of Russia. They try to find a way to justify Russia, which is absurd because there's no tie between Russia and Soviet Union. I mean, the economic principles or anything else, there's nothing in common. So, but why do they come to this conclusion? Who knows? But they are following a policy that would support Russia because they wish to support Russia. But I think there's another element to this, which the FBI announced a few weeks ago, which is that there's evidence now that Russia has financed political parties in more than a dozen countries. And I think that the actual truth, if we really get into it, is, and I'm not saying anyone specifically, but I think that if a lot of these politicians were being investigated further, how their parties were financed and how their political campaigns were financed, we might find that there's a Russian hand in this, which would explain their support as being more than just ideology, but simply an economic factor that drives them to do it.
What the role